February 5th, 2026. The nuclear treaty that kept America and Russia from destroying each other just expired. 7 days later, on February 12th, a Russian oil tanker is sailing toward Cuba carrying 700,000 barrels of crude. And 3 days before that, a Russian military cargo plane touched down 90 miles from Florida at a Cuban airbase. This isn't random timing. This is Moscow breaking every pattern America has relied on for 5 decades. Because here's what nobody in Washington is saying out loud. Russia just demonstrated they can move freely in America's backyard. While the US was distracted by Iran, by Israel, by everything happening in the Middle East, Russia made its move. The New START treaty died February 5th. For the first time since Richard Nixon, there are 0 limits on nuclear arsenals, 0 inspections of missile silos, 0 verification of warhead counts, 0 transparency about what either side is building. That treaty capped deployed strategic warheads at 1,550 for America and 1,550 for Russia. Those numbers meant something. They meant satellites could count delivery systems. They meant inspectors could visit facilities. They meant predictability. Now those numbers are meaningless. Russia could have 2,000 warheads deployed tomorrow, or 3,000, nobody would know. America could do the same, build in secret, deploy without announcing. The entire architecture of nuclear stability just collapsed. And Putin knows exactly what message that sends. He offered to extend limits for 1 year in September 2025. Trump said it sounded reasonable. But he never signed anything. The treaty expired anyway. No extension, no replacement. So on February 2nd, just 3 days after expiration, the Russian Il-76 military cargo plane landed in Cuba, San Antonio de los Baños Air Base, the same airfield where Soviet nuclear missiles were positioned in 1962. The aircraft can carry 50 tons of military equipment, or 200 fully equipped troops. Moscow won't say what was aboard. Flight tracking data shows it made stops in St. Petersburg, Sochi, Mauritania, Algeria, and Dominican Republic before Cuba. Each of those stops required government permission. That means multiple countries approved Russia moving military cargo toward America. The operator is Aviacon Zitotrans, sanctioned by the US, Canada, Ukraine, and EU for transporting weapons globally. This is the same aircraft type that delivered S-300 air defense systems to Venezuela before Maduro's capture by US forces. Russia calls this routine military cooperation, standard transport operations between allies. Nothing for Washington to worry about. But US intelligence analysts see something else. They see the exact same warning pattern that preceded Venezuela. Trump declared Cuba a national security emergency on January 29th, called it an extraordinary threat to the United States. 4 days later, the Russian military plane lands. Moscow isn't hiding this, they're advertising it. And now, today, February 12th, a Russian oil tanker is crossing the Atlantic heading directly for Cuban ports. The vessel is carrying 700,000 barrels of crude oil. Russia is calling it humanitarian assistance for energy-starved Cuba. But here's what that really means. Cuba's economy is collapsing. Power outages last 18 hours daily in Havana. Russia is offering to keep the lights on. In exchange for what? Military basing rights? Intelligence facilities? Missile deployments? The White House hasn't commented on the tanker. They haven't explained why Russian military aircraft can land freely in Cuba. They haven't addressed how Putin is rebuilding Soviet air influence 90 miles from Florida while nuclear limits disappear. And that silence is telling. Because this isn't about one plane or one tanker. This is about what happens when treaties die. When the New START treaty expired February 5th, it didn't just remove warhead limits. It removed the predictability that kept everyone safe. For 50 years, America and Russia knew roughly what the other side had. How many missiles, how many warheads, where they were. That knowledge prevented miscalculation. It prevented arms races that bankrupted nations. It prevented someone from thinking they could win. Now that knowledge is gone. And Russia's immediate response was to move assets toward American territory in ways not seen since the Cold War. Drop a comment if you think Putin planned this exact sequence. Hit like if this feels like 1962 all over again. Because what happens next depends entirely on whether Washington understands what Moscow just did. And I'm not sure they do. On Monday, February 9th, Cuba's electricity deficit hit nearly 2,000 megawatts during peak hours. That's total system failure. Havana went dark for 19 hours and 47 minutes on Sunday alone. Hospitals are running on backup generators that depend on diesel nobody has. Water pumps stopped working because they need electricity. Food spoiled in refrigerators that haven't had power in days. This isn't new. Cuba's grid collapsed 4 times in the last 6 months. But this time it's different. This time there's no rescue coming. Venezuela used to send oil. Not anymore. U.S. forces captured Maduro in January. Venezuelan oil shipments to Cuba stopped immediately. Mexico used to help. Trump threatened Pemex with tariffs if they kept delivering fuel to Cuba. Mexico backed off. Even China's solar projects can't save them. Beijing promised 2,000 megawatts of solar capacity across 92 parks. Only 100 Mau is operational. That leaves Russia, the only country still willing to send oil to Cuba despite Washington's pressure on every supplier, shipper, and insurer. And that's not charity, that's leverage. Because when you're the only one keeping a country's lights on, you own that country. The Russian tanker heading to Cuba today isn't carrying just 700,000 barrels of crude. It's carrying Moscow's price for that fuel. What does Russia want? The same thing they wanted in 1962. A military presence 90 miles from American territory. But this time they don't need to sneak missiles in under cover of darkness. They can negotiate openly while America watches helplessly. Because Trump has a problem. If he blocks Russian oil to Cuba, millions of Cubans face a humanitarian catastrophe, mass starvation, complete grid failure, a refugee crisis that makes the Mariel boat lift look small, all heading toward Florida. But if Trump allows Russian oil deliveries, Putin gets exactly what he wants. Military cooperation agreements in exchange for energy. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said, regime change in Cuba is the goal by end of 2026. Trump called Diaz-Canel to make a deal before it's too late. Except Cuba can't make a deal without Russia's permission now, not when Moscow controls whether Havana keeps functioning. And Russia is playing this perfectly. They offered to extend New START limits for 1 year. Trump didn't sign, so Putin let the treaty die. Then immediately moved military assets toward Cuba, then offered to save Cuba's economy. All while reminding Washington that nuclear arsenals are now completely unconstrained for the first time since Nixon. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said yesterday Moscow won't rush to build more weapons. But he also said Russia considers itself no longer bound. That's diplomatic language for, we'll do whatever serves our interests. And right now, Russia's interests involve rebuilding influence in Cuba. Here's what nobody's connecting. The treaty expiration and Cuba aren't separate events. They're sequential moves in the same game. Step 1, let nuclear limits expire. Remove the constraints that kept both sides predictable. Create uncertainty about what comes next. Step 2, move military cargo to Cuba while America is distracted. Test whether Washington will respond. They didn't. Step 3, offer energy aid to Cuba when they are desperate. Lock in leverage over a country 90 miles from Florida. Step 4, wait for America to realize Putin now has options in the Caribbean that didn't exist when treaties were enforced. And here's the calculation Russia is making. China is adding 100 new warheads per year. They're at 600 total now. Moscow wants trilateral arms control talks, but only if they include UK and France. That's 290 and 225 warheads, respectively. Washington wants China included without UK and France. Beijing refuses to negotiate because they claim their arsenal is too small. So no new treaty is coming, no limits, no inspections, no verification of what anyone is building or deploying. That means Russia can expand their nuclear force without restriction, and simultaneously rebuild Soviet-era influence in Latin America. The oil tanker arriving in Cuba today is Moscow's down payment on that strategy. Keep Cuba functioning, gain military access, position assets near American territory, all while Washington struggles with how to respond without triggering humanitarian disaster. Trump's options are terrible. Blockade Russian oil shipments and watch Cuba collapse into chaos, or allow deliveries and watch Putin expand presence. Either choice empowers Moscow. Either outcome shows American allies that Washington can't prevent Russian moves in its own hemisphere. And Putin is counting on that, because when allies see America can't protect its own backyard, they start questioning security guarantees. If Russia can land military cargo in Cuba and deliver oil freely despite U.S. opposition, what does that say about American power? What does it mean for Baltic states worried about Russian pressure? For Poland watching Moscow's moves? For anyone relying on Washington? The nuclear treaty dying wasn't just about warhead limits. It was about removing the framework that made American power predictable. Now nothing is predictable. Not what Russia will build. Not where they'll position assets. Not what they'll demand in exchange for restraint. And Cuba is the demonstration. The proof that Moscow can operate in America's hemisphere when nuclear constraints disappear. That's what changed February 5th when New START expired. Not just numbers on missiles, but the entire stability architecture. Russia knows this. They're moving fast before Washington figures out how to respond. Military plane, oil tanker, what comes next? Trump has a choice, and every option leads to disaster. On February 3rd, he said publicly that America is in talks with the highest people in Cuba to negotiate a deal. Wall Street Journal reported the goal is regime change by end of 2026. Trump wants to cement his legacy by ending the Castro era, something John F. Kennedy failed to do in the 1960s, something every president since has avoided trying. But here's the problem Trump faces. Cuba won't negotiate without Russia's permission, not anymore, because Russia controls whether Cuba keeps functioning. The oil tanker sailing there today proves that leverage is real. Trump can threaten Cuba all he wants. He can impose tariffs on any country selling them oil. He already did that January 29th. But Russia is already sanctioned by the US over Ukraine. Additional sanctions mean nothing. Moscow has nothing left to lose economically. So Putin can supply Cuba indefinitely without consequences Washington hasn't already imposed. That's asymmetric leverage. Cuba's deputy foreign minister said it clearly February 4th. We're ready for meaningful dialogue, but not about regime change. President Diaz-Canel echoed that. Dialogue under pressure is impossible. We won't discuss our constitutional system. Translation: Moscow told Havana not to surrender, and Cuba is following orders because they have no choice. Secretary of State Marco Rubio wants regime change. He's been saying for months the government is on the verge of collapse. He's building the case for action, creating expectations among Cuban-American voters in Florida who delivered that state to Trump. But regime change requires either military invasion, which Trump has avoided throughout his political career, or internal collapse. Internal collapse requires cutting off all support to Cuba. Every oil shipment, every dollar, every connection to the global economy. Except Russia is supplying oil right now. Mexico is still considering humanitarian aid. China could provide alternative support. So complete isolation isn't achievable unless Trump is willing to impose secondary sanctions on Mexico, threatening their trade relationship. Mexico was America's top trading partner January through November 2025. That's hundreds of billions in annual commerce. Threatening tariffs on Mexico over Cuba means risking economic relationship that employs millions of Americans in border states. Trump's own executive order weaponizing tariffs against countries that supply oil to Cuba creates that exact problem. If Mexico sends one humanitarian oil shipment, Trump either enforces tariffs and damages U.S. economy, or backs down and loses credibility. Either way, Putin wins, because the goal isn't saving Cuba. The goal is demonstrating American power has limits, and those limits become visible when Washington can't prevent Russian moves 90 miles from Florida. But there's another calculation happening simultaneously that makes everything more dangerous. The nuclear arms race just restarted. February 5th, New START expired. For the first time since 1972, no treaty limits how many warheads America and Russia can deploy. America has 3,700 total warheads. Russia has 4,379. Those numbers could double within years. Nobody would know until it's done. China has 600 warheads. They're adding 100 per year. Pentagon estimates they'll reach 1,000 by 2030, maybe 1,500 by 2035. Trump wants trilateral arms control. America, Russia, China, all included. Beijing refuses because their arsenal is smaller. Russia says if China is included, then UK and France must be too. That's 290 and 225 warheads, respectively. Washington says no. Moscow says talks won't happen without UK and France. Beijing says talks won't happen at all, so no treaty is coming, no limits, no inspections, no verification of what anyone is building or where it's deployed. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said February 11th that Moscow will stick to old limits voluntarily if America does the same, but that's not binding. It's a political statement that can change whenever circumstances require. No enforcement mechanism exists, and circumstances are changing fast, because Russia's move into Cuba creates pressure for American response. If Washington does nothing, allies question whether U.S. can protect its own hemisphere. If allies doubt, security guarantees mean less. If security guarantees mean less, countries start hedging, building their own capabilities, seeking alternative arrangements. That's exactly what Putin wants. Fracture American alliance system by demonstrating Washington can't enforce its own red lines. The nuclear treaty dying and Cuba aren't separate issues. They're sequential pressure points designed to test American resolve simultaneously. Test 1. Can Washington prevent Russian military cargo reaching Cuba? Answer: no. The plane landed February 2nd. Test 2. Can Washington stop Russian oil deliveries to Cuba? Answer: the tanker is crossing the Atlantic right now. Test 3. Can Washington force Cuba to negotiate regime change? Answer: Cuba just rejected that publicly. February 4th. Each failed test demonstrates limits of American power, and those limits matter when nuclear arsenals are unconstrained, because if Russia can operate freely in Cuba, and if no treaty limits their nuclear expansion, what stops Moscow from deploying weapons there? Not immediately, not next week, but over time, gradually building facilities, positioning assets, creating facts on the ground. Same pattern as 1962, except this time there's no treaty framework preventing escalation, no diplomatic channel managing crisis, just two nuclear powers testing each other while a third, China, expands its arsenal in the background. Trump's negotiators understand this. That's why they're trying to force Cuba to deal before Russia locks in permanent presence. But the timing doesn't work. Cuba won't negotiate under pressure. Russia won't stop supporting Cuba. Mexico won't risk economic war. And meanwhile, the clock is running on how long America waits before responding to pattern that looks increasingly like Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0. Except in 1962, Kennedy could threaten blockade and Khrushchev backed down because Soviet economy needed Western trade. In 2026, Russia's economy is already isolated. Sanctions are already maxed. Putin has nothing left to lose economically. That makes him more dangerous, not less. Because leaders with nothing to lose make calculations others won't. The oil tanker reaching Cuba today isn't charity. It's down payment on influence that could reshape Western Hemisphere security. And Trump's options for stopping it are terrible, all of them. That's the bind Putin engineered by timing everything perfectly. Treaty expires, military plane lands, oil shipments begin, Cuba rejects negotiations, all within 10 days. That's not coincidence, that's strategy, and it's working. So let's step back for a second and look at what just happened across these 10 days in February 2026. A nuclear treaty expired. A military plane landed in Cuba. An oil tanker set sail with 700,000 barrels. Cuba rejected American demands openly. Each event, taken alone, could be explained away. Routine cargo flights happen, oil deliveries happen, diplomatic statements happen every single day. But all four happening in tight sequence within 10 days of each other is not routine. That is a coordinated message sent deliberately by Moscow. And the message is blunt. Russia can still operate in America's hemisphere. Right now, Washington cannot stop it from doing exactly that. Here's what should concern every American paying attention. This is not the end of the sequence. This is clearly the beginning of something larger. Because what Russia just demonstrated in Cuba is a repeatable playbook. A template applied wherever economic desperation creates usable leverage. Think about what Moscow did step by step. Find a country under maximum pressure. Offer what no other government is willing to provide right now. Lock in access before Washington organizes a coherent response. Then use that access to negotiate what Moscow actually wanted all along from the start. Cuba is the proof of concept. The same playbook works in Nicaragua, in post-Maduro Venezuela, across significant parts of Africa where sanctions left gaps. Russia does not need these countries to be powerful. Cuba just needs to sit 90 miles from Florida. That geography is the entire strategic point. A signals intelligence post near Havana can monitor military communications across the southeastern United States with remarkably basic equipment installed. The NSA knows this, the Pentagon knows this, which is why every American administration worked to isolate Cuba for 60 years without full success. And here is what has fundamentally changed in 2026. Every tool Washington used to maintain that isolation is now exhausted or actively backfiring on them. Sanctions on Russia are already fully maxed out. Secondary pressure on Cuba hurts American trade partners more than it hurts Moscow in any real way. Military escalation risks the exact confrontation both governments publicly say they want to avoid under the current circumstances we are all watching. Diplomatic leverage? Cuba told the State Department on February 4th, clearly and publicly, that regime change is simply not available for negotiation. So Trump is left with symbolic pressure and strongly worded statements. Symbols do not move countries whose lights are kept on by Russian oil. In my view, this is the most underreported strategic shift of early 2026. Not because Cuba itself is a dominant economy or a major military power, but because the precedent being set right now is enormous for how the rest of this decade plays out across multiple global theaters at once. Russia just showed that in a post-treaty world, the informal geographic restraints governing superpower competition no longer carry enforced weight at all. For 50 years, there was an unspoken agreement. America stays out of Russia's near abroad. Russia stays out of America's backyard. Both sides held that line. That agreement was backed by nuclear treaties, functioning diplomatic channels, and economic ties that made violations genuinely costly for both sides involved. Now the treaties are gone. U.S.-Russia economic ties are essentially zero. Diplomatic channels are barely functional. The enforcement mechanism has evaporated completely. And Moscow is openly testing that reality right now, 90 miles from American shores. Washington is still trying to figure out how to respond. Here's the question worth sitting with carefully. Is Cuba actually the goal, or is Cuba a calculated distraction from something else moving quietly? While every analyst focuses on the oil tanker and the cargo plane, what else might Moscow be positioning that nobody is currently watching closely enough? Russia spent 10 days ensuring every foreign policy analyst is looking hard at Havana right now. That level of visibility is itself a strategic choice. Somewhere in the gaps between those loud headlines, something else may already be moving that we have simply not yet identified or publicly named. That is what happens when verification frameworks collapse. Not just the warhead limits they enforced through counting and mandatory inspection schedules, but but the entire visibility architecture that let both sides distinguish real threats from deliberate feints across 50 years of managed competition. Now that architecture is gone, Russia can reposition warheads without notification, they can expand forces without transparency, they can move without announcing, and they can use Cuba loudly and visibly while doing something else entirely in the background. That is the real strategic value of this sequence. Not the oil tanker, not the cargo plane, but the deep uncertainty both generate about what is actually real versus what is sophisticated misdirection. Because strategic uncertainty is the most dangerous condition between nuclear-armed powers. More dangerous than most specific weapons or deployment decisions made. That dynamic restarts arms races that bankrupt nations, accelerate dangerous miscalculation, and create the exact conditions where catastrophic accidents become likely. That is, the chain reaction New START was specifically designed to prevent from restarting. As of February 5th, 2026, nothing is preventing it at all. So when you see that oil tanker on your news feed crossing the Atlantic toward Havana today, understand what you're actually looking at beneath it. You're not watching a humanitarian mission. You're not watching routine logistics. You're watching the opening move of a post-treaty world forming. A world where old rules are being rewritten in real time by the side, willing to move first and move fast before organized responses can take shape. The question is not whether Washington will eventually respond to what is happening 90 miles from Florida. Some kind of response will come eventually. The question is whether that response arrives before the facts on the ground in Cuba become too permanent and too deeply embedded to reverse without real crisis. Once Russia fully locks in its position through energy agreements, military cooperation frameworks, and infrastructure quietly built across the island over time, reversing it requires costs. America has not shown willingness to pay. That is precisely the window Putin is methodically working inside right now in 2026. 10 days in, the window is still open. But every oil tanker that docks in Havana closes it a little more, and right now, one is on its way. Drop your read on what happens next in the comments below. And if this kind of analysis is what you come here for, you already know what to do.